Hello students, welcome back to this video tutorial. In this video, we will be continuing the play The Boy Comes Home by A. Milne. In the previous video, we have discussed the theme, the character, and we have also discussed about the society and the crisis that was prevalent then, in the post-war England. Now in this video, we will be discussing the text. So here, as we have already discussed in the previous video, let me just give you a brief plot about the play. The play is a comic play, which throws light on the generation gap. A comedy is usually closer to everyday life situation as it appeals to the senses more than a tragedy. It explores human failings in a witty manner rather than tragedies, disastrous crime. Its ending is usually happy, In a comedy play, it's usually a happy ending, especially for the leading characters. In this play, the plot revolves around the notion of what the old generation thinks and believes and their attitude towards the younger generation. The older generation thinks that the young generation is immature and therefore has to abide by what it thinks and says. In fact, the play goes on to show that the younger generation is mature enough and is capable of taking the right decision. Here is a very brief summary of the play. Here, 23 years old Philip. Philip, we have already discussed the character of Philip in the previous video. 23 years old Philip has spent the last 4 years serving as an officer in France. Now, with the war just over, he finds himself back in his Uncle James and Aunt Emily's house, living yet again under his uncle's rules. However, Philip is a changed man, having spent the last 4 years giving orders and growing up very fast. Immediately, Philip changes the protocol of his uncle's house, greatly irking his uncle in the process. Uncle James is keen to secure Philip's future, and as his guardian, automatically assumes that Philip will follow him into the family jam business. As James prepares to confront his nephew, he feels asleep. Or does he? Coming to Uncle James finds himself confronted by an intimidating, threatening Philip, who has been profoundly affected by his experience at the Battle of the Somme. As he reminds his uncle, "I am never going to be frightened again," brandishing his revolver. Philip turns the table on his uncle, forcibly demanding respect and leaving James cowering his chair. However, was it all a fantastical nightmare during a quick snooze? When Philip reappears, he is charming, amenable, and willing to go along with his uncle to the business. But Uncle James and the readers are left unsure as to what really happened. And Philip's tantalizing throwaway comment that he might bring his revolver leaves everyone guessing. Now let's discuss the play in detail. The play opens with Philip, the young Philip or old Philip, according to you, he's 23 years old, entering the dining hall and demanding his breakfast. Philip returns back from the war after a long and tough period. He is now in the mood of leisure. He gets up late and goes to the morning room for breakfast at 10 o'clock. He finds nothing on the table and orders Mary, the parlor maid, to serve him with eggs and coffee. She tells him that Mrs. Higgins does not like irregularities. She is very punctual, and according to master's rule, she prepares breakfast at 8 o'clock. Mary is afraid that Mrs. Higgins will be annoyed at her if she goes to her for breakfast. In the meantime, Aunt Emily enters the room and discusses about his stint in the army and if he slept well the previous night. A few moments later, Mrs. Higgins enters and Philip demands for breakfast. She replies firmly that breakfast is available only at 8 o'clock. She refuses to obey him and talks in an arrogant manner. She threatens to give a 1-month notice. Having seen the haughtiness of Mrs. Higgins, Philip uses a strategy and at once orders her to leave the job and offers check of her wages. She is taken aback and does not expect such behavior of Philip. It is astounding to her. She takes back her notice and goes away. Next, then Uncle James enters and asks about Philip. Aunt Emily tells that he is taking his breakfast. Uncle James dislikes his slackness. He tells that he should be very punctual. He wants to discuss Philip's future. He has a plan for the boy. He wants him to work in his office. Aunt Emily tries to convince him that Philip is no more a boy but a man. She says that Philip will not follow his instructions. Uncle James tells that he knows Philip's weakness and will not give Philip money which is due to him. Aunt Emily informs Philip that his uncle is waiting for him, to which Philip answers carelessly that his uncle can come to meet him. Philip does not like his uncle since he was a school-going boy because he feels his uncle is a disciplinarian. On his return from the army, he expected that his uncle will treat him like a grown-up responsible person. But Uncle James feels Uncle James here, waiting for the boy, he rather felt tired and sleepy as he was sitting by the fire and was reading morning paper. And he starts dozing off. He sees Philip entering the room to meet his uncle. Philip starts smoking and Uncle James gets angry and rebukes him for his smoking in his presence. Uncle James advised him to learn civility and respect for elders. He tries to impress him with his experiences and awful personality. He orders Philip to join into his jam business. But Philip wants to be an architect. They wrangle with each other. And finally, Uncle James threatens him that he can stop the payment of the amount which is left for Philip by his father at the attainment of 25 years of age. So in order to receive the amount of money, Philip has to be 25 years old. So on this, Philip says that he is already 25 years old. Okay, though he is just 23 years, he narrated an incident where he believed that he has turned 25 or 35 or 45. Okay, so according to him. So what happened at Somme is, an incident at Somme. It happened at Somme, the front where Philip's company was to attack next day. They reached in a trench. The Germans knew about them. Therefore, they were firing at them. The company commander wanted to move from the place. He asked his commander about that. The commander ordered them to stay there and wait until the next day. Later, the Germans killed the company commander. After his death, now Philip was the company commander. He knew something about scouting too. Therefore, he found another trench that was better than the first trench. He sent 2 men, one after the other, to ask if he could move that trench. However, they did not return back. They had lost about half the company by that time. Now Philip had 3 options. Firstly, he might stay there and wait until the next day. Secondly, he might move to the other trench against the orders given by the higher authorities. Thirdly, he might go back himself and explain the situation to the company. It was a very difficult situation. He had great responsibility on his shoulders. At that time, lives of many soldiers depended on him. He took a very matured and responsible decision. He moved the company to the other trench. Then he went back to the company and told them that he had moved. After that, he went back to the company again, and this is where he believed he was 25 or 35 or 45. So here, according to Philip, maturity, or being matured, is a state of mind when a man can make judicious decisions in critical situations, showing full responsibilities. He gives an example of how he was able to manage his troops in the army. Uncle James acknowledges his admirable performance as company commander, but he says it does not qualify him to make a decision for the choice of his future career, as Philip's father had entrusted him to see the welfare of his son. When ordinary arguments fail, Philip tells his uncle flatly that he cannot be treated as a schoolboy, and he should understand that 4 years' war service has changed him from a boy to a man. Mr. Philip tells his uncle that he cannot frighten him by any method. His threats cannot impress him. He tells his uncle that a military brigadier could not intimidate him in spite of being in full uniform, decorated with 20 medals. When reasoning fails, Philip tells his uncle that in the army they were taught to use force to put down force. Hence, now he will act upon the lesson he learned in the army. After that, Philip takes out his revolver. Uncle James is terrified to see the revolver in Philip's hand. Philip says that he will not hesitate to kill him because he has already killed 20 men. Uncle James tried to dodge Philip with his oily tongue, but all in vain. Philip becomes harsh. He behaves severely with his uncle. He uses force to suppress force. Uncle James becomes soft and yield. Philip succeeds in his scheme. At this point of time, Uncle James wakes up from his dream. Do you remember? He dozed off while reading the book and sitting by the fire. So the whole situation was a dream. So he woke up and now he finds Philip coming to meet him. He was terrified initially, but you see that Uncle James was still reeling under the influence of the dream, and he became quite friendly with Philip now. But Philip, on the other hand, agrees to join his uncle in the family's jam business. Uncle James proposes to introduce Philip to Mr. Bamford, who is their manager. He warns Philip that Mr. Bamford can be a stiff person. Philip decides to take his revolver just in case he needs to deal with Mr. Bamford. He leaves the room. Uncle James laughs nervously and wonders if he really dreamt or was it a reality. We see Philip's convincing power and his ability to take decisions on 2 occasions. Okay, so this is the end of this play. Now there are 2 more topics that I would like to discuss, and that is the conflict in the play. Okay, the conflict is dream or real. Is it a real, or was it just a dream? And the symbolic significance of dream. Okay, so let us discuss one after the other. The first one, as we see, is the conflict. Okay, the conflict is real or unreal, or is it a dream? So we have to regard that the play The Boy Comes Home is a comedy, not an action play, and a comedy always has conflicts, but it ends happily, satisfying the feelings and emotions of the audience. Okay, so the play obviously has a conflict in it. The conflict is quite a vital one. A typical Victorian style uncle wants his nephew to obey his commands. The uncle is very severe as regards discipline, and the boy is a characteristic example of carelessness. Yet the boy, Philip, is energetic and young, retired from the army. Then there is the question of the young man's future. Mr. James, or Uncle James, is a highly experienced person with gem business. Obviously, he wants his nephew to join that business. But as a matter of fact, it is less likely to happen. Uncle is strict and the other person is not the other person, this uncle. Okay, this uncle is very difficult person. He is not going to break the rules and regulation. Sometimes we say, hard nut, isn't it? So he's hard nut to crack. So there is enough space for the conflict. The two doesn't go. Okay, so here the conflict between Mr. James and Mr. Philip to sort out what profession should be adopted by Philip. He starts waiting for his nephew. In the meantime, he falls asleep. In his dream, his nephew comes to him. He wants to start some business of his own. His uncle refuses, and Philip insisted upon them. His uncle refuses to pay him the amount desired and asks him to join the gem business with him. Philip does his best to persuade his uncle, but it was in vain. His uncle does not move. Now Philip takes out his revolver and forces Uncle James to surrender before his wish. Now Uncle James becomes fully frightened and gives in. As we have mentioned before, the play is a comedy, and a comedy has to do justice to all the characters. It must be satisfying, okay? It must satisfy the taste and feelings of the readers also, and the audience as well. And it should not excel the code of ethics by any means. Had the action been real, it would mean humiliation and insult for the uncle, an elderly person, isn't it? A younger person trying to threaten using a revolver is not ethical at all. So for one reason or the other, the correction was necessary for Uncle James, but not a punishment. Okay, so a real action would have shocked us because Mr. James or Uncle James passes for Philip's father. The writer chose a dream for the correction of the severe and overcommitted disciplined person, Mr. James or Uncle James. Hence, the use of dream as an alternative of the real action is very well justified on account that the play is not an action play, rather a comedy, and it must have an ending on a happy note. Next, the symbolic significance of dream in The Boy Comes Home. Okay, now the dream is taken as a light-hearted episode only because the play ends happily, while the uncle is never certain of whether it was reality or a mere dream. He keeps guessing at the amazement of his life, but looking at the horrible end of it, all forces us to call a spade and admit that the dream is in fact, a nightmare. And nightmares just betray and dread us of possible fears and shadows of unwanted tortures that haunt us. The dream of Uncle James is the dread of the effects of war on the youth of Philip. His nephew that just returned after taking part in a war. The dream is a clear symbol of how much war could degrade human mental and more faculties had there been no legal and moral constraints of society. Therefore, the playwright has visualized the impact of war damages, no matter be it with the victorious or the losing nation. In strict terminology of the sane world, nobody wins except the ugliness and sorrows at the end of a war. So this is all for this video. I hope you have learned and understood it. Do watch it for several times. If you want to thoroughly understand, read the textbook and you will understand it better. Thank you.